Condemned in the dead of night as a social outcast, yet this same man once carried the sacred sword of state. We examined Lord Beauchamp, the gay servant Fetish, and royal exile King George V tried to bury. Why did the British establishment violently erase its own titan? William Lygon's collapse was as monumental as his birthright. He was born into a vast aristocratic inheritance. His ancestral home, Madresfield Court, was a massive, moated estate that would later serve as the direct inspiration for Evelyn Waugh's novel, Brideshead Revisited. From the moment of his birth in 1872, his life was meticulously engineered for imperial leadership. He was educated at Eton and Oxford, molded to govern, and expected to embody the absolute moral and political authority of the British ruling class. He rose swiftly through the ranks of the Liberal Party. He became the governor of New South Wales at an unusually young age and eventually took his place as the leader of the Liberals in the House of Lords. He was a man who crafted the laws of the land. In 1902, he secured his power through the ultimate aristocratic alliance. He married Lady Lettice Grosvenor, sister to the Duke of Westminster, widely considered the wealthiest man in England. To the outside world, their union was the picture of Edwardian perfection. They produced 7 striking children, hosting grand social events and representing the idealized nucleus of the British elite. However, historical consensus and private correspondence from the era suggest that this was an elaborate facade. It was a classic lavender marriage, a structural necessity designed to fulfill dynastic duties. Once the heirs were secured, the Earl and his Countess lived profoundly separate, intimate lives. While he played the role of the devoted patriarch in public, his genuine desires pulled him toward a world that his peers viewed with absolute contempt. Beneath the heavy robes of state, Lord Beauchamp lived a life of intense contradiction. The aristocracy of the early 20th century operated on strict boundaries of class and propriety. Lord Beauchamp rejected both in his private hours. He was a homosexual man whose specific attractions subverted the very hierarchy he represented. Bypassing the company of his noble peers, his desires were firmly fixed on the working class. He harbored a deep, enduring fascination with men in uniform, specifically the young, muscular servants who maintained the massive machinery of aristocratic life. His lovers were the footmen who polished the family silver, the valets who laid out his clothes, and the chauffeurs who drove his motor cars. This behavior went far beyond simple indiscretion. To the conservative establishment, it was a terrifying inversion of the natural order. In the years following the First World War, the British upper classes were deeply paranoid about socialism, the rise of the working class, and the erosion of their traditional authority. An earl treating his footmen as intimate equals was viewed not merely as a moral failing, but as an act of class betrayal. Lord Beauchamp managed this dual existence by utilizing his vast wealth to create isolated pockets of freedom. When the pressure of London became too great, he would travel to the continent. He frequented the luxury hotels of Paris, Rome, and Venice, rarely taking his wife. Instead, he traveled with a carefully curated entourage of young male staff. In these distant, opulent spaces, the traditional master-servant dynamic dissolved. Accounts from the period suggest these trips were characterized by champagne, silk pajamas, and elaborate parties where the Earl and his servants engaged in prolonged, hidden intimacies. For years, His immense privilege acted as a shield, allowing him to live a life of complete duality. But this shield was entirely dependent on the silence of his peers, and that silence was about to be broken by a man who harbored a deep personal vendetta. The architect of Lord Beauchamp's destruction was his own brother-in-law, Hugh Bendor Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster. Bendor was a man of staggering wealth, but he was also known for his deeply reactionary politics, his aggressive temperament, and his intense homophobia. He despised the liberal politics that Beauchamp championed, and he grew increasingly suspicious of the rumors surrounding his sister's husband. Bendor did not simply want to embarrass Beauchamp, he wanted to obliterate him. Operating with the cold precision of a military campaign, the Duke of Westminster utilized his vast financial resources to hire a team of private detectives. For months, these investigators shadowed the Earl across Europe. They interrogated former household staff, tracked down dismissed footmen, and intercepted deeply personal correspondence. Bit by bit, they assembled a devastating dossier of undeniable proof. It was a collection of photographs, testimonies, and passionate letters written in the Earl's own hand to men who worked beneath him. When the trap was finally sprung, Bendor executed it with ruthless cruelty. Bypassing the authorities, Bendor delivered the secret files directly to his sister, Lady Lettuce. Confronted with undeniable proof of her husband's hidden life, her reality shattered. Historians note that the revelation caused her to suffer a severe mental and emotional collapse from which she never fully recovered. With his sister incapacitated and his enemy's family fractured, Bendor escalated his attack to the highest possible authority. He bypassed the police and took his evidence straight to Buckingham Palace. The Duke of Westminster demanded a private audience with King George V. When he presented the dossier, it came with a brutal ultimatum. Bendor threatened that if the king did not personally intervene to remove this deviation from society, he would release the entire file to the national press. He made it clear that the ensuing scandal would not only destroy the Liberal Party, but would deeply humiliate the monarchy itself. After all, it was the king who had personally bestowed the Order of the Garter upon Beauchamp. It was the king who had allowed this man to carry the sword of state. The reaction within the palace walls was one of profound panic and revulsion. King George V was a traditionalist, a man who believed implicitly in the moral purity of the ruling class. Upon learning that his trusted peer was engaging in intimate acts with footmen and valets, the monarch's response was swift and chilling. While precise conversations behind closed doors are rarely recorded verbatim, the king is widely reported to have expressed a terrifying sentiment. He allegedly stated his belief that men who committed such acts should have the decency to shoot themselves. This was not a passing comment. It was the unspoken expectation of an empire that prioritized reputation over human life. The establishment did not want justice. They wanted the problem to disappear quietly. A trial was out of the question. A public prosecution would have dragged the sordid details of aristocratic hypocrisy into the daily newspapers, exposing the fragile human flaws of the elite to a working-class public that was already growing restless. To protect the institution, the government and the monarchy colluded to force Lord Beauchamp into immediate exile. The execution of this royal mandate was swift and absolute. In the dead of night, authorities arrived at Madresfield Court. There were no handcuffs, no formal reading of rites, and no public spectacle. Instead, Lord Beauchamp was given a terrifyingly brief window of time to pack a few belongings, say a hurried goodbye to his bewildered children, and flee the country. The terms were clear. He was to leave the United Kingdom immediately, and he was never to return. If he set foot on British soil again, the full weight of the law and the total destruction of his family's name would fall upon him. In a matter of hours, the man who had helped govern an empire was reduced to a fugitive. His name was quietly struck from public life. He resigned all his offices, surrendered his leadership, and was essentially erased from the political landscape. Lord Beauchamp began a long, tragic wandering. He drifted through the hotels of Germany, Italy, and eventually as far as Australia. He was a man without a country, severed from the ancestral lands that had defined his entire existence. The exile inflicted deep, permanent wounds on his family. His children were torn apart by the scandal. His younger daughters were strictly forbidden from contacting him, kept in the dark about the true nature of his sudden disappearance. His sons, however, particularly his eldest, remained fiercely loyal, defying their mother and their powerful uncle to visit their father in his lonely European outposts. The family became a tragic microcosm of the broader societal hypocrisy, fractured by a secret that the establishment could not tolerate. The tragedy of William Lygon is a profound testament to the conditional nature of power. He was a man who possessed every conceivable advantage: wealth, title, land, and the ear of the king. Yet all of it was instantly vaporized the moment his personal truth conflicted with the moral theater of his class. The establishment did not punish him merely for his sexuality. They punished him for pulling back the curtain on the illusion of aristocratic superiority. He was sacrificed to maintain the pristine facade of an empire that was already beginning to crumble. In his lonely, wandering final years, the former Earl stood as a stark reminder of a brutal truth. The highest levels of society would readily devour their own to keep the lower classes from seeing the fragile human reality hidden beneath the velvet robes. Back in London, the machinery of the elite cover-up moved with terrifying efficiency. The disappearance of the Liberal leader in the House of Lords, a Knight of the Garter, and the Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports could not go entirely unnoticed. Yet the official narrative was controlled with iron-fisted precision. King George V and his advisors understood that a public scandal involving the intimate lives of the aristocracy and their servants would be devastating in an era already fraught with class tension and the rising tide of the labor movement. There was no formal press gag, but in the aristocratic circles of 1931, the unspoken rules of the gentlemen's clubs dictated the news. Fleet Street editors, many of whom dined in the same exclusive establishments as the politicians, understood that certain lines were not to be crossed. It was announced, vaguely and quietly, that Lord Beauchamp had suffered a sudden nervous breakdown and had resigned his offices to seek rest abroad. The resignation of his prestigious honors was handled with a deliberate, bureaucratic silence. The sword of state was passed to another. The empty seat in the House of Lords was filled. The establishment closed ranks, smoothing over the violent extraction of one of their most prominent figures with the polite language of diplomatic illness. While London manufactured its polite fictions, the reality at Madresfield Court was a scene of domestic devastation. The sprawling, moated manor house, once the vibrant center of Edwardian social life, descended into a state of oppressive mourning. Lady Lettice, the Countess Beauchamp, was left to govern the ruins of her family. Confronted with the undeniable photographic and written evidence of her husband's parallel life, her reaction was not merely one of betrayal, but of total ideological collapse. She was a woman raised within the rigid moral framework of the late Victorian and Edwardian eras, an environment that provided absolutely no vocabulary or psychological framework to process her husband's homosexuality, let alone his specific preference for working-class men. Historical records indicate that Lady Lettice retreated into a state of severe religious fervor and bitter isolation. The humiliation inflicted upon her by her own brother, the Duke of Westminster, combined with the betrayal of her husband, fractured her mind. She ordered a brutal physical erasure of William Lygon from the family home. Portraits of the Earl were quietly removed from the grand galleries. His personal effects were boxed away. His name became a forbidden word within the walls of Madresfield. The vast army of servants, the very class of men that had been the focal point of the Earl's forbidden desires, were left in a state of bewildered silence, navigating the sudden, terrifying absence of their master and the erratic, grieving demands of their mistress. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, transforming from a vibrant political hub into a silent mausoleum guarding a shameful secret. The cruelty of this erasure was orchestrated by the one man who remained triumphant in the wake of the disaster, Hugh Grosvenor, the Duke of Westminster. Bendor, as the Duke was known, positioned himself as the moral guardian of the aristocracy, the righteous avenger who cleansed the establishment of a degenerate element. Yet the Duke's own private life was a spectacle of public scandal. He was a man of insatiable appetites, married 4 times, and famous for his highly public, extravagant affairs, most notably with the French fashion designer Coco Chanel. He scattered illegitimate children and broken vows across Europe. However, in the rigid moral calculus of the British upper class, Bendor's rampant heterosexuality, no matter how destructive or cruel, was tolerated as the natural privilege of an extremely wealthy nobleman. It reinforced the patriarchal order. Lord Beauchamp's transgression conversely subverted that order. By seeking intimacy with his social inferiors, Beauchamp had committed the unforgivable sin of compromising the dignity of his caste. Many historians argue that Bendor destroyed his brother-in-law, not out of a genuine sense of moral purity, but because Beauchamp's actions threatened the rigid class boundaries that gave men like the Duke of Westminster their absolute power. Meanwhile, on the continent, the newly exiled William Lygon began to navigate a surreal, shadowy existence. The early days of his banishment were characterized by a nomadic wandering through the grand hotels of Europe. From Paris to Wiesbaden, from Rome to Venice, he moved like a ghost through the playground of the international elite. He was a man accustomed to being surrounded by deference, a man who had dictated the political fortunes of a nation, now reduced to writing letters to his lawyers and waiting for modest financial allowances. The irony of his situation was profound and bitter. In exile, stripped of his titles and his public duties, he was technically free to pursue the life and the company he had always desired in secret. There were no longer any parliamentary sessions to attend or royal ceremonies to perform. Yet this freedom was bought at the cost of his home, his reputation, and most agonizingly, his family. The emotional core of Lord Beauchamp's Exile, and the aspect that elevates his story from a mere political scandal to a profound human tragedy, lies in his relationship with his children. The sudden, violent fracturing of the family forced the 7 Lygon siblings to make impossible choices. Lady Lettuce, consumed by her religious mania and fueled by the toxic influence of her brother Bendor, demanded absolute loyalty from her offspring. She strictly forbade them from communicating with their exiled father, portraying him as a monster who had brought unbearable shame upon their ancient bloodline. For the younger children, still entirely dependent on their mother and the estate, the pressure was insurmountable. However, the older Lygon children launched a quiet, determined rebellion that would define the rest of their father's life. William, the eldest son and heir to the title, along with his brother Richard and his fiercely independent sisters Mary and Dorothy, refused to abandon the man who had raised them. Despite the overwhelming social stigma and the direct threats from the wealthiest man in England, these children maintained a secret transatlantic lifeline to their father. They orchestrated clandestine meetings in European cafes and grand hotel lobbies. They smuggled letters past their mother's watchful eyes. These moments of reunion in Paris or Venice were fraught with a terrible, fragile beauty. The children would travel from the oppressive, silent halls of Madresfield Court to sit with their aging, disgraced father in a foreign land, offering him the only tether he had left to his former humanity. The correspondence between Lord Beauchamp and his loyal children during these years provides a heartbreaking glimpse into the soul of a broken titan. His letters are not the writings of a defiant revolutionary or an unrepentant hedonist. They are the desperate, tender dispatches of a father mourning the loss of his world. He wrote obsessively about the gardens at Madresfield, asking for detailed descriptions of the blooming seasons, the state of the moat, and the repairs to the old chapel. He sought news of his dogs, his horses, and the local villagers. Through his children, he tried to violently pull the tactile reality of his English estate across the borders of Europe. He was a man consumed by homesickness, enduring a punishment that the ancient Greeks considered worse than death, the total severance from one's native soil. Yet even in these secret meetings, the shadow of his specific desires and the reason for his exile remained a complex, unspoken barrier. The children loved their father deeply, but they were also products of their time, forced to reconcile their immense affection with the overwhelming social condemnation of his sexuality. They navigated this by compartmentalizing his identity, fiercely protecting the loving father they knew, while deliberately looking away from the intimate truths that had destroyed him. It was a sophisticated, agonizing psychological dance. They stood by him against the cruelty of their Uncle Bendor and the hysteria of their mother, but they were powerless to reverse the decree of the king. They could only offer comfort to a man who was slowly fading away in the bright sunlight of the Italian Riviera, a tragic monument to the devastating cost of a society that demanded perfection at the expense of truth. The silent, suffocating atmosphere of Madresfield Court during these years of banishment did not remain entirely sealed from the outside world. Into this fractured mourning household stepped a young, observant writer named Evelyn Waugh. Waugh was an Oxford contemporary of Lord Beauchamp's second son, Hugh Lygon, a young man whose astonishing physical beauty was matched only by his deep, unresolved melancholia. Through Hugh and later through his close friendships with the vibrant Lygon sisters, Mary and Dorothy, Waugh became an intimate witness to the ruins of the Beauchamp dynasty. He spent extensive periods at Madresfield, observing the bizarre polarized reality of the estate. On one side was the rigid, unforgiving piety of Lady Lettice, who isolated herself within the grand rooms of the estate. On the other was the unspoken, agonizing absence of the patriarch, a man loved desperately by his children, but legally and socially dead to the nation. Many literary historians and biographers now universally recognize that this specific tragic family dynamic provided the direct, indispensable architecture for Evelyn Waugh's most enduring masterpiece, Brideshead Revisited. The novel is not a direct, factual biography, but a profound emotional translation of the Lygon family's collapse. In the book, the exiled Lord Marchmain, living in disgraced splendor in Venice, is a direct reflection of Lord Beauchamp. The fiercely religious, oppressive Lady Marchmain mirrors Lady Lettice, and the doomed alcoholic Lord Sebastian Flight is widely considered to be heavily inspired by Hugh Lygon, who would himself die tragically young. Waugh took the brutal, unseemly reality of a political blackmail and a homosexual scandal and elevated it into a sweeping theological meditation on divine grace, the decay of the English aristocracy, and the crushing weight of family legacy. Through Brideshead Revisited, the destruction of Lord Beauchamp achieved a strange, immortal afterlife. The British establishment had tried to erase him completely from the national memory, striking his name from official records and whispering his fate only behind the closed doors of gentlemen's clubs. Yet by inspiring one of the greatest novels of the 20th century, the core truth of his emotional exile was preserved for millions of readers who would never know his actual name. It is a striking paradox of history, the very mechanisms of censorship and societal rejection that sought to bury William Lygon ended up guaranteeing his story would outlive the empire that condemned him. While his children unwittingly helped immortalize his tragedy in literature, the flesh and blood Lord Beauchamp was still enduring the grueling reality of his physical banishment. Europe, despite its vastness and its relative tolerance in certain enclaves, eventually began to feel too small. The proximity to England was a constant psychological torment. He was only a train ride and a short channel crossing away from his beloved Madresfield, yet an impenetrable wall of royal decree kept him out. The elite circles of Paris and Rome were heavily populated by British expatriates and traveling aristocrats. Every social encounter carried the risk of running into a former colleague from the House of Lords, a friend who had turned their back, or an informant who might report his movements back to his vicious brother-in-law in London. Driven by a desperate need for absolute distance, Lord Beauchamp made a decision that highlighted the profound tragedy of his shifting fortunes. He boarded a ship and set sail for the southern hemisphere, charting a course for Australia. This was not a random destination chosen for its remoteness. It was a devastating return to the theater of his greatest early triumph. Decades earlier, in 1899, a 27-year-old William Lygon had arrived in Sydney as the newly appointed governor of New South Wales. At that time, he was a golden child of the British Empire, stepping off the ship to the sound of brass bands, military salutes, and cheering crowds. He had been the king's direct representative, living in the palatial government house, dictating policy and hosting the most vital colonial figures of the age. He had been, for all intents and purposes, the closest thing the colony had to a monarch. Now, in the 1930s, the former viceroy returned to Sydney Harbor not to the sound of cannon fire, but in crushing anonymous silence. Archival records from his time in Australia paint a portrait of a man entirely hollowed out by his circumstances. He did not seek out the grand estates or the political elite who might have remembered his tenure. Instead, he rented modest accommodations, living a quiet, transient life on the edges of the city he once ruled. The psychological whiplash of this return is difficult to overstate. He walked the same streets he had once paraded in full ceremonial dress. He looked up at the gates of Government House. This was a building where he had once commanded an army of servants, the very men whose intimacy had cost him his entire world. In Australia, the true weight of his isolation settled upon him. The letters he sent back to his loyal children from Sydney are devoid of the frantic, hopeful energy of his early exile in Europe. They are the writings of a man who has finally accepted the permanence of his defeat. He wrote of the harsh Australian sun, the alien flora, and the vast, terrifying ocean that separated him from everything he understood. He was aging rapidly, his health beginning to falter under the sustained stress of public humiliation and private grief. He had become a ghost, haunting the site of his own former glory. Back in London, the political landscape was shifting dramatically, yet the establishment's stance on Lord Beauchamp remained paralyzed by an unyielding moral absolute. The 1930s were a decade of rising global terror. The dark shadows of fascism were gathering in Germany and Italy, and the British government was increasingly consumed by the looming threat of a Second World War. In the face of such monumental existential danger, the fact that an aging earl had once preferred the company of footmen in his private bedroom should have seemed entirely irrelevant. A rational society might have recognized the absurdity of maintaining a relentless vendetta against a broken man while European democracies were collapsing. However, King George V and the conservative power brokers who surrounded him were not operating on logic. They were operating on the preservation of a myth. The myth was that the British ruling class possessed an innate, unassailable moral superiority that justified their wealth and their power. To forgive Lord Beauchamp, to allow him to return quietly to his estates and live out his final years in peace, would be an admission that the aristocracy was capable of fundamental human deviation. It would mean acknowledging that the man holding the sword of state was no better and perhaps far more complex than the man polishing his shoes. The system could not survive such an admission. And so, while the world prepared for the greatest conflict in human history, the British establishment held firm to its petty, cruel decree, ensuring that the 7th Earl Beauchamp remained a prisoner of the vast open ocean, staring out from the shores of a colony he once commanded, waiting for a pardon that he knew would never arrive. The profound isolation of the Southern Hemisphere eventually proved too heavy a burden for a man whose entire life had been defined by connection, politics, and influence. Australia was a vast, beautiful continent, but for William Ligon, it was merely a sunlit prison. The psychological toll of his banishment began to manifest physically. His health, once robust and commanding, started to visibly deteriorate. He was a man aging not just by the passage of time, but through the corrosive effects of a broken heart and a destroyed reputation. This internal collapse was violently accelerated in 1936 by a tragedy that would extinguish the last remnants of the Earl's fighting spirit. While Lord Beauchamp was wandering through his lonely exile, his second son, Hugh Lygon, was fighting his own desperate battles. Hugh was a young man of astonishing physical grace, deeply loved by his peers at Oxford, but he was also profoundly lost. The destruction of his family and the exile of his beloved father had left him untethered, driving him toward severe alcoholism and aimless wandering across Europe. In August of 1936, while traveling in Germany, Hugh suffered a catastrophic accident. He fell, fractured his skull, and died shortly after. He was only 31 years old. The news of Hugh's death struck Lord Beauchamp with the force of a physical blow, but the true agonizing cruelty of his situation was yet to come. The British establishment and his own vindictive wife, Lady Lettice, offered no clemency in the face of this profound grief. The royal mandate remained absolute. Lord Beauchamp was strictly forbidden from returning to England to attend his own son's funeral. While Hugh was laid to rest in the ancient grounds of Madresfield Court, surrounded by the weeping remnants of the Lygon family, his father was forced to mourn in total agonizing isolation thousands of miles away. It was an act of bureaucratic cruelty that highlighted the absolute mercilessness of the moral code that governed the British elite. Shattered by the loss of his son and increasingly aware of his own failing health, Lord Beauchamp made his final migration. He left Australia and traveled to the United States, seeking refuge in New York City. By 1938, New York was a towering metropolis of steel and glass, aggressively modern and largely indifferent to the antiquated velvet-draped scandals of the British aristocracy. Here, William Lygon found a different kind of anonymity. He took up residence at the Waldorf Astoria. The hotel was a marvel of Art Deco luxury, filled with wealthy industrialists and European expatriates fleeing the impending shadow of the Second World War. Yet for the former Earl, the grand lobbies and silent suites were merely a sterile, commercial imitation of the ancestral halls he had permanently lost. He was a man completely out of time and out of place. He walked the bustling streets of Manhattan as a ghost of the Edwardian era. The metropolis offered him safety from the prying eyes of London society and the vicious reach of his brother-in-law, the Duke of Westminster. But it could not offer him a cure for the cancer that was now ravaging his body. By the autumn of 1938, it became clear to the doctors in New York that the illness was terminal. The man who had once carried the sacred sword of state for King George V was now confined to a hotel bed, thousands of miles from the damp green soil of the English countryside that had defined his lineage for centuries. In his final weeks, the immense transatlantic distance was bridged by the quiet, defiant loyalty of his surviving children. Despite the ongoing fury of their mother and the absolute disapproval of the British establishment, his eldest son, William, and his devoted daughters crossed the ocean to be at his side. They gathered in that high-rise hotel room above the streets of New York, standing watch over their dying father in his final hours. They brought him news of the changing seasons at Madresfield, They read to him, and they offered him the simple, unconditional dignity that his country had violently stripped away. In those quiet hours, the contradictions of his life seemed to distill into a profound stillness. He was no longer the imposing political titan of the House of Lords. He was no longer the reckless hedonist, chasing forbidden intimacies in the luxury hotels of Venice. He was simply a dying father, holding the hands of the children who had refused to let him face the dark alone. He did not speak of the king's betrayal, nor did he rage against the hypocrisy of the Duke of Westminster. His final thoughts, according to the letters and memories of those who were there, were entirely focused on the home he would never see again. On November 14th, 1938, at the age of 66, William Lygon, the 7th Earl Beauchamp, drew his last breath in a foreign city. His death marked the end of a terrifying 7-year exile. He had outlived the monarch who banished him, King George V having passed away 2 years prior. Yet, the machinery of the establishment that had sought to erase him from history was still very much in place. The man was dead, but the secret he represented still possessed the power to strike fear into the heart of the British elite. The true test of his legacy and the final judgment of his peers would only be revealed in how they chose to bring his body home. The news of William Lygon's death in a New York hotel room presented the British establishment with a deeply uncomfortable logistical problem. He was no longer a Knight of the Garter. He was no longer the Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports. Officially, he was a disgraced exile, a man whose very existence had been scrubbed from the polite conversations of London society. Yet by the inescapable laws of blood and inheritance, he remained the 7th Earl Beauchamp. He was the patriarch of an ancient aristocratic lineage. His body could not simply be discarded in a foreign cemetery. The problem of what to do with his remains forced the royal court and the government to confront the man they had spent 7 years trying to forget. The repatriation of his body was handled with the same cold, terrifying efficiency that had characterized his exile. There were no public statements of mourning from Buckingham Palace. There were no eulogies delivered on the floor of the House of Lords. The men who had once dined at his table, drank his champagne, and relied on his political patronage remained entirely silent. Some historical records indicate that the press was subtly discouraged from publishing anything beyond the most basic factual obituaries. The establishment treated his death not as a tragedy, but as the final necessary resolution to a lingering embarrassment. For his loyal children, however, the journey home was an agonizing pilgrimage. His eldest son, William, who instantly inherited the title to become the 8th Earl Beauchamp, took charge of the grim proceedings. He and his sisters arranged for their father's casket to be placed in the dark cargo hold of an ocean liner. This was a profound and bitter reversal of his earlier travels. When Lord Beauchamp had crossed the oceans as the governor of New South Wales, he had stood on the upper decks receiving the salutes of naval vessels. Now he returned across the Atlantic in absolute silence, hidden away in the dark, a piece of controversial freight being smuggled back into his own country. The ship arrived in England without ceremony. The contrast between the supreme power he once held and the clandestine nature of his return is stark. This was the man who had held the heavy jewel-encrusted sword of state at the coronation of a king. Now, his wooden coffin was quietly unloaded at the docks, shielded from public view, and loaded onto a private train bound for Worcestershire. The British elite had demanded his absence in life, and they demanded his invisibility in death. When the train finally reached the countryside, the atmosphere shifted entirely. In London, Lord Beauchamp was a scandalous secret, but in the villages surrounding Madresfield Court, he was remembered quite differently. Many historians note that despite his devastating fall from grace in the capital, the Earl had been a remarkably progressive and generous landlord to his tenant farmers and the local working class. He had funded local schools, supported agricultural improvements, and maintained a close paternalistic relationship with the surrounding community. To the villagers, the complex hidden sexual life of the aristocracy was a distant, abstract concept. They simply remembered a man who had treated them with consistent fairness. Therefore, the final leg of his journey was not marked by the cold judgment of his peers, but by the quiet respect of the common people. As the hearse drove through the country lanes toward the estate, local workers and villagers lined the roads. They stood in the damp English chill, removing their caps and bowing their heads as the disgraced Earl finally returned to his ancestral lands. It was a striking visual contradiction. The highest echelons of power had abandoned him completely, yet the lowest tiers of the social hierarchy, the very class of men whose company had triggered his downfall, offered him his only genuine honor in death. The funeral itself, held at the small parish church of St. Mary the Virgin on the Madresfield estate, was a masterpiece of fractured family dynamics and unspoken tension. The guest list was a physical map of the devastation wrought by the scandal. The grand political figures of the era were conspicuously absent. The pews were not filled with dukes, marquises, or government ministers. Instead, the congregation consisted primarily of his loyal children, the estate staff, and a few brave friends who refused to yield to the social pressure of the establishment. Conspicuously, the architect of his destruction did not attend. Hugh Grosvenor, the Duke of Westminster, remained in London, completely unrepentant. Many historians argue that Ben-Dor never viewed his actions as anything other than a necessary cleansing of the aristocracy. He outlived his brother-in-law by many years, continuing his own highly publicized, chaotic lifestyle without ever facing a fraction of the moral scrutiny he had ruthlessly applied to Lord Beauchamp. The Duke's absence at the funeral underscored the absolute hypocrisy of the moral code that governed the British elite. More tragic, perhaps, was the presence of Lady Lettice. The Countess Beauchamp had spent the last 7 years nursing a profound, religiously fueled bitterness toward her husband. The revelation of his intimate life had shattered her reality, and she had allowed her brother's venom to dictate her emotional response. Now she stood by the open grave of the man she had married, the father of her 7 children. Eyewitness accounts from the period are scarce, but some documents suggest an atmosphere of terrible frozen grief. The family stood together physically, but they were emotionally severed by years of forced separation and deep ideological divides. They buried William Lygon not as a unified family mourning a patriarch, but as survivors of a silent war burying a casualty. The Lygon family, profoundly scarred, eventually faded from political power. Upon the death of the last surviving brother in 1979, the ancient earldom of Beauchamp went entirely extinct. Madresfield Court survived, passing through the female line. It stands today surrounded by its ancient moat as a silent witness to a man who possessed every conceivable advantage, only to be crushed when his private reality collided with the fabricated morality of his class. He was a victim of a society that valued the appearance of honor far more than the practice of justice. The man who held the sword of state was ultimately cut down by it.